Hello, welcome to Interdependent Study, our podcast where we engage in the learning and unlearning work for social justice and collective liberation. I'm Aaron.
Very good, Aaron. I'm Damien. Thank you so much for joining us today.
For those new to our podcast, Interdependent Study is meant to be a space and community for folks who believe in and want to do the work of social justice.
Each week, we bring something new to the table and discuss our thoughts and feelings about it through the lenses of who we are and where we can go for a more just society.
Correct. We want Interdependent Study to be a space where we're always learning with one another. Damien, you're up this week. What are you bringing to the table today?
Is this how it's going to be?
This is, yeah.
Yeah.
We're going to do it.
All right. I have brought, spoiler alert, a zine to the table for us today. This zine is actually the first in a series of follow-up resources in response to the Abolition and the State discussion tool that we had the pleasure of talking about in our last episode from our good friends over at Interrupting Criminalization. This zine that we read was released back in September and is called Abolition and the State Responses Volume 1. And what's great about this zine, I think, is that it draws its content from two conversations that took place in the fall of last year, 2022. So one was a conversation between Andrea Ritchie, Robin Maynard, and Leanne Betasamasake Simpson. And the other was a conversation between Dean Spade, Harsha Walia, and William C. Anderson. And I think what's awesome about that is that we've actually talked about work from a few of these folks here on the podcast in the past. So that was awesome.
Yeah.
But this zine, I think, provides a lot of responses to the questions that were raised in the discussion tool, which I think is really incredible. At one point in the zine, it says this, which I think sums up the goal of the zine and why it's so helpful pretty well. It says, quote, "At the root of these questions and tensions lies the question of what our relationship to the state is and should be as abolitionists, and what role the state can play in abolitionist futures." So, yeah, I'm excited to talk about this. Where do you want to start? What did you think of this scene?
You know, I really thought they phoned it in on this.
You did, huh?
Yeah. No, I thought this was such a great way to follow up last week in our discussion on the original discussion guide, and to see how some people who have done some great work, who we've talked about on the podcast before, responded to the questions that were posed in that original discussion guide.
Right.
And there's so much depth and richness in the responses to these questions that it, that was captured in these two conversations.
Right.
Which, it's from two conversations, but they merged them together pretty seamlessly.
Yes, absolutely.
Which I appreciated. And as I flipped through the PDF, there's something that I highlighted on almost every page, but there's definitely something highlighted in each section. If it's not every page, it's at least in each section of each question. And the opening quotation from Robert Maynard, I thought was also a great way to encapsulate what the discussion is about and what some of how the answers to the questions were captured.
Yep.
So it says, if we worked toward the abolition of the carceral parts of the state, would it be recognizable? Would it matter if we called it the state? Would it matter if we called it something else? So like I said, that's from Robert Maynard, and it's such a brilliant line of thinking because it points to how removing functions of the state fundamentally changes the values and purpose of the state to potentially not even being recognizable, not even being what it is that we know about the state as it exists today.
Yes.
And I think that's a valuable line of thinking to follow as we consider what an abolitionist future looks like, because we have to think about what are the things that we keep and what are the things that we toss out.
Right.
And not everything has to be tossed out fully. We need to scrape off the carceral parts of it. I think about, and this was an example in the zine and in the conversations, the way that mental health policing and carcerality is seeping into mental health.
Yes, how they're linked.
So some of those mental health systems don't have to be tossed out, but we have to think about how we remove that function,
or the carceral piece,
that piece of it from it. So I just think, and then if we do that, is it still the same thing? Right. Maybe, maybe not, but it's something to wrestle with.
Yeah, I think that quote is so great from Robin. I think what it also does, you spoke about it, but another thing it does, it just allows for the possibility of something new. It allows us to think about and to dream about the possibility of something new. And so, this idea of would something be recognizable? Would it matter if we called it by this name? Would it matter if we called it something else? That to me incites this dreaming, possibility. And and just, again, the possibility of what could be. And I love that, right? I love that this is what this zine is focused on, and allowing us a glimpse into what these brilliant folks think about these questions. And so I think that's why these things work so well together. Like, this zine is incredible in conjunction with the discussion guide. It's incredible. It's just a really great resource for all of us, for abolitionists, to really grapple with these questions about the state, about power, about our future and the future we want. And so two of the quotes, actually, that I thought were so incredible at the beginning of this zine, I wanted to share them. One was from Dr. Robert D.G. Kelly at his speech at the Socialism 2022 conference. And the other is from Miriam Kaba and Andrew Ritchie from their book, No More Police, which we were literally right before this recording talking about No More Police and how we're so excited to read it. But both of these quotes, I think, really set the tone for both why this work is important and for actually then engaging with it. So at the conference, Dr. Kelly said, quote, "Revolution becomes a problem if we believe that the state is the site of struggle. We take the state and overturn social relations. We have learned that this is not necessarily the case. We need a new way of thinking, an independent way of thinking that the state is the problem. There's clear evidence of that. What does revolution mean in a discourse, in a framework in which we are questioning the state as the primary source of actually making things happen?" So I love that question. I think it speaks to Robin's quote, this idea of what's possible, what could be. So then the other quote, Miriam Kaba and Andrew Ritchie asked this question in their book, quote, "What additional possibilities emerge if we move beyond the dichotomy of capturing or dismantling the modern Western state? What if our goal is not to seize the carceral state in an effort to transform it, but to seize power and resources from the police state to create conditions under which new economic systems and forms of governance can emerge?" And so, for me, these thoughts from Dr. Kelly and Miriam Kaba and Andrew Ritchie really chart anyone engaged in this work on a path of exploring, again, what's possible. And I really appreciate not only their work to answer these questions and for that to be a resource to us as we do it, but also for just their brilliance in doing that and being this starting point, if you will, of doing the work that's presented in this book, in this zine, I should say.
Yeah, I think that was a really great way to ground the zine as it got started and to give it a foundation to build on.
Yes.
So one of the pieces that I really loved after that, it was kind of toward the beginning, was this quotation from Dean Spade.
Oh, yes.
Where he's responding to the question about how we define the state.
Right.
So he says, quote, "We know that the state in all its forms, state, local, federal, and in individual systems and institutions like schools, hospitals, jails, maintains a monopoly over the legitimate use of violence in governance. It is the only entity allowed to rule, and when it does violence through war or policing, it is not considered violence. That is its key role, even if it sometimes provides programs under the guise of care. I would also argue that one of the key functions of the state, even if we were to imagine a utopic state, is that if that were to exist, it would always have a border, right? And a central function of states is to decide who does and does not belong, and to enforce that with border violence." I think that is such a key way to describe what the nation state is and give us a real sense of what it does and how it operates. It legitimizes its own use of violence while condemning and ostracizing other forms. It controls who is supposed to belong here. And while it provides care, it only does that at the margins. It's not a core function of it. And those have been reforms that people who have been working against the state created. And in some ways, the state has co-opted to say, okay, well, we'll give you this so that we can continue to exist in the way that we do.
Absolutely.
And so I thought it was such a great way just to understand what it is the modern nation state is and how we exist within it.
Yes, how it's grown, how we exist within it. And there was so much in this zine from Dean Spade that I thought was he is brilliant. But this idea, I think that the central piece or the one part of that I thought was so important and I pulled out as well was this idea that it legitimizes its own use of violence. And so it does these things to quote unquote care for us and provide services to us, but it also slaps us in the face. And in some cases, it murders us. It puts us in prison. So that to me was so brilliant. And I think a way for folks to sort of see what the state is. And that's the question he was answering, and to get a sense of what that is. And I thought that to me was the most powerful part of this whole zine. The fact, again, that we're getting answers to these big questions from these incredible folks. So I also pulled a couple of their responses to those questions. What shapes our understanding of the state, and how do you define the state? So one of them was from Harsha Walia. The quote is this: "Where I am, the carceral state, the Western state, the liberal state, the modern nation state, they're all the same thing. They're all constitutive of and made up of these same forces of violence." And then Andrew Ritchie said this: "These experiences helped me to see states in different forms and understand that they're not necessarily one thing, that they are the product of conditions and contestations for power. They're not a fixed thing. Yet in each of those cases, they were deeply shaped by racial capitalism and settler colonialism." And so when you have a chance to listen to and hear from Dean and Andrea and Harsha and all of these folks, I think there's such incredible power and usefulness in this zine, and for abolitionists and for all of us to think about what it is that we can do, what it is that we can imagine for ourselves and our future.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that I really enjoyed about it is the way that they talked about what the state is in the context of thinking about what the experiments look like. And they get into this a little bit later. But, I mentioned it before that some of these things get co-opted by the state, some of these experiments.
Right.
And the way that they're talking about it is, okay, yeah, on this broader level, the state exists. And it makes me think about the quote you shared last week of like the pragmatism, like part of me thinks this.
Yes.
The anarchist part of me thinks this. And the way that they're grappling with it holds all those things as true, all of those complexities.
Right.
And so you see it come out in the way that they're talking about what the state is, where it is we can go, what we can do with what we have right now, and also what we need to do to move beyond what the carceral state is in this moment. And it's all of those things all at once, which I think is really great.
I think that's great. I will add one more thing to what you just said. I think the other thing that they do so brilliantly is that they also bring themselves to the questions.
Oh, absolutely.
So many of them talk about their personal experiences and where they lived and how they moved and how they grew up. And so I think there's that's particularly beautiful too, and important for when you're engaging in this work. It's personal, right? And we all bring stories and interactions with the state to this work, and so they didn't shy away from that. They brought themselves to this work. They shared that with us in the zine, and I think that's only helpful, again, if you're truly committed to engaging in this work.
Yeah. And thinking about how we interact with the state, Andrea Ritchie at one point points out how the state has effectively de-skilled us. When she's talking about that, she's referencing both Dean Spade and Robin Maynard as folks who are bringing that analysis sort of publicly.
Yeah.
So she says, quote, "It has made us into people who delegate everything to the state. We've lost the capacity of just picking up the phone and checking on our neighbor instead of calling 911. We've lost the capacity to de-escalate a conflict instead of calling a cop who will most likely escalate in very harmful ways instead. We've lost the capacity to grow food for ourselves and for each other. We've lost the capacity to do lots of things that we can do for ourselves and each other." Wow. And that makes me think about how we acquire those skills again. Like, one, yes, 100% on the analysis of how little that we can do for ourselves without the state.
Right.
And without us having to go to the state and having delegated all those things to whatever the state looks like in those functions. But there's ways that we can learn those things again. And I think that's what the key next step is for me as I think about it, is we need those skills in a lot of ways to be able to continue the experiments and figure out how we can cooperate with one another in a foundational way that eschews the current hierarchy of the state and our relationship to it. Because our lives, so much of our lives are filtered through the state and our interactions with it, that we almost become separate entities from each other.
Yes.
Because we're in relationship with the state and not with each other. So, like the way that we've delegated all these functions, she says we can't pick up the phone and check on our neighbor instead of calling 911. If we did that, the state isn't in that relationship anymore in the same way.
Right.
And I think that those are key skills we have to think about how to regain. And some of that needs to be formal and some of it can be informal. being able to pick up the phone and call your neighbor and check on them, everybody has the capacity to do that.
Yep.
But we don't think we have the capacity to do it in the same way.
Yeah.
And yeah, so I thought that was also brilliant, both analysis and also as a question for us to consider, how do we get those things back? How do we train ourselves up to have those skills again?
Yeah, it was one of those things when I read that. I read this zine over several days, and that was one where it sort of stopped me in my track because it made me sort of sit and think, well, can I do these things? Do I do these things? Like, what's our natural inclination? And what, as Robin points out, what have we been trained to do? And so, I think, and this probably transitions us into application, into homework so brilliantly, but this idea
Thank
that, maybe I think Robin should take some credit there.
Yeah.
And Dean, and Andrea, everybody. Everyone gets a gold star. But like, what could that look like for us? Like, that's a piece of application of this, maybe a piece of homework for all of us to do. What are the ways, how can you examine your own actions and the ways in which you're interacting with your neighbors, with your family, with strangers, for goodness sake? Again, as you say, we're all people. We're all in this together. And what are the ways in which, you can, in those moments, force yourself to do this as opposed to that?
Yeah.
I love that. All right, well, let's transition to application. We're already there, right? How are we going to use this zine? How are we going to use this discussion about this incredible zine and apply it to our everyday lives and our work? And, so I think you already got us there. So I want to co-sign that. I think what this zine does, obviously in conjunction with the discussion guide, is really highlight, I think, the imperative that exists in our society and our world. And that imperative is our future, and what kind of future we want and we need to have for our collective liberation, right?
Yeah.
And you started to talk about that a little bit. I love that the zine points out that abolitionists are not dreaming about some faraway future with this work. The work is about actively trying to make demands and organize effectively and enact accountability measures and to fight for institutions that actually serve us and to shape policy, I think, and decisions that make that future we know that we need and we want an actual reality. And so the application, just like it was with the discussion guide, I think, is that this zine, these questions are so important and are so helpful for us to create the ideas and the frameworks and the possibilities to do all of that. And so to me, it's all about the future and what can be and what we absolutely need given everything we've been through. Like, we cannot go back. We cannot go backwards. And so that to me is some application from this. What were you thinking about?
Yeah, I love that. That's a really great thought, because it's not about some faraway future. Like, that's part of the little experiments, is that you create the little experiments in the spaces that you have access to.
Absolutely.
To do that.
And then if you can do that, what else can you do? And what can you encourage other people to do in your world?
Yeah. So I don't want to be too repetitive here, but I guess I'm gonna. I think the application for me this week is the same as I brought last week.
Yeah.
How do we engage with what currently exists to find the things that we can take to an abolitionist future, no matter what we call it, if it's a state or a collective or a commune, whatever it is. What are the things that we keep from the current world because they serve us, and the things that we want? Yeah, they probably need to evolve a little bit.
Right.
And they need to be centered more on care and less around scarcity and less around fear. But at the core, they still do something good.
Yes.
And I think about, the simple things are like education and libraries and, maybe a healthcare that's not extractive and exploitive and grounded in capitalism. But there are things there that we can take.
Yes.
And strip of the rest of it. So, how do we salvage those things and pull out policing, pull out carcerality from him, and bring those things that we can salvage to a future where care and healing and justice and liberation, freedom are centered. And these are conversations in the zine that get at a lot of that for me and get us started on those roads in a lot of ways. And so I just appreciated that and think that my application is very similar to last week. Like, we've got things that exist that work. We've got a lot of things that exist that don't work.
Right.
And how do we keep what we need and throw away what we don't.
And I don't think there's anything wrong with some repetitive application when it's coming from these two pieces that work in tandem, and they're so brilliant and so helpful. So I love that too. All right, let's talk about homework. How do we want to continue our learning once we leave this little table of ours today? I definitely think an easy thing for homework is for us to go ahead and engage with the next and second zine in response to this discussion tool. The first one was so good. And I haven't looked at all at the second zine and what its content is, but I can't imagine there is not more learning that we can do with that second one. The other thing I was thinking about doing is I actually want to watch the recordings of the two main conversations that this zine pulls a lot of its content from. So the first conversation, I don't think I actually said their titles. The first is a conversation called The Role of the State in Abolitionist Futures, and you can find that on YouTube. I think we both have seen bits and pieces of that one because we read an analysis from it, but I'd like to go ahead and just watch the entire thing. The second conversation, and I haven't seen any of this one, is called No Borders, No Prisons, No Cops, No War, No State, ? And you can find that one on the Barnard Center for Research on Women's website. So I think it'd be so cool just to see what do we call that in school? The original citation, the original work. The primary source. Let's go to the primary source and hear directly from the folks. And I think that will help inform some of the great things we read from them in both the discussion guide and the zine. So that's what I'm thinking. What about you?
Cool. I like that. Yeah, I was thinking about wanting to go back and especially watch the Haymarket one, which is that first one, the role of the state in abolitionist futures.
Yes.
Because it seems great.
Yeah.
My homework here this time is to read a couple of the books that are mentioned, which have been on my to-read list for a while, honestly. The first one is Rehearsals for Living by Robert Maynard and Leanne Betasumasake Simpson, which is described by Haymarket Books as, quote, a revolutionary collaboration about the world we're living in now between two of our most important contemporary thinkers, writers, and activists. And the second one is No More Police by Andrea Ritchie and Miriam Kaba, in which they, quote, detail why policing doesn't stop violence, instead perpetuating widespread harm, outline the many failures of contemporary police reforms, and explore demands to defund police, divest from policing, and invest in community resources to create greater safety through a Black feminist lens. Yes. So those have been on the to-read list for a while. Might as well just move them up. So I imagine we'll be talking about those in the next couple months of the new year, which is coming up soon.
I think I so enjoyed the fact that we read books, one book a month this year. So I think we should continue that in 2024. And those two should absolutely be on the list for 2024. Let's do it. Yeah. All right, my friend. Well, you're up next time. What are you bringing to the table in our next episode?
I don't know if I'm actually up, or if I'm bringing the thing to the table, or if this is a shared thing.
I think it's a shared thing, sure.
It's late December,
right?
Which means it's time for our podcast year in review episode. So that'll be our next episode. We'll reflect on the year and some highlights for each of us individually, and then bring those lists to the table to discuss them without either of us having shared them before. So there might be some overlap. There will be some cool things that I think we've done a lot of stuff this year.
Yes.
And so I'm excited to see what stood out for us, because so much of the year for me right now is a blur.
Yeah.
And I can remember a lot of, especially the books that we read, but there's so many things that we engaged with, and new baby at home, lots of things happening in life. Like, I don't remember.
Yeah.
There's just weeks where I'm like, we did that.
Yep.
And I don't, right. I'm going to be able to go through the history and all of our episodes and see, and have my memory jogged and be like, oh yeah, that was great.
Yes.
Cool.
Yes.
So I'm looking forward to the conversation, because it's a fun one we have every year.
Absolutely. Yeah, same. This year was wild in so many ways. And I know that there are things I'm forgetting about. But I'm so excited about the conversation that we had. And maybe I shouldn't say this, because this is going to maybe spoil what I might say next week. I'm so energized by the conversation we had today, the conversation we had last week about these two things. And I know while I might not remember what it is that we talked about every single week this year, I know I felt this way before. This feeling feels familiar. I think this has been a great year for us. So I'm excited for us to engage in our year in review next time.
Yeah.
Very good. Cool. All right. Well, with that, we want to thank you for joining us today and for listening to Interdependent Study. We hope you're as jazzed as we are about this conversation that we had today. You know what we want you to do here, but in case you forgot, please follow, leave a rating and review, share our podcast with everyone you know, follow us on the socials, check us out on YouTube, and sign up for our email list to get notified about any new things we've got going on behind the scenes.
Yes, thank you so much for listening. And remember, it's not about us, but it is about us. And we'll talk to you next week.